In our last class, we covered the limitations of the criminal justice approaches as a cure for human violence. Whereas the use of force, especially in irregular implementation, can be problematic, the rule of law is especially essential in setting norms and boundaries of acceptable behavior. We see how this works in international law, our topic for today. International law plays a critical role in global violence prevention by establishing institutional frameworks that constrain the use of force, protects human rights, and facilitates peaceful dispute resolution. At its core, international law limits violence by defining when force is lawful, primarily through the United Nations chapter, and by regulating how force may be used, even when permitted, through bodies of law such as international conventions and the laws of armed conflict. These rules do not eliminate violence, of course, but they significantly narrow the circumstances in which states may resort to it and impose accountability when violations occur. International law also contributes to prevention by creating mechanisms for peaceful settlement, including adjudication, arbitration, and diplomacy, which offer states alternatives to armed conflict. Human rights treaties, monitoring bodies, and international criminal tribunals further work to deter violence by strengthening protections for vulnerable populations, delegitimizing abuse, and signaling to perpetrators that they may face consequences. Of course, international law depends on a general cooperation between states. For example, it supports global cooperation against transnational terrorism, human trafficking, and cyber attacks by harmonizing national responses and promoting information sharing. Imperfect and uneven enforcement, which can sometimes contribute to violence, just like in criminal justice, rather highlights the importance of international law and how indispensable it is for us to invest in it as a consistent tool for promoting stability, reducing harm, and building a more peaceful world order. The study of international law is an ongoing effort to understand how norms emerge, how authority is generated, and how nations should behave toward one another. Far from being a static field, international law involves a myriad of theoretical approaches, each offering distinct insights into the nature, function, and evolution of legal norms across borders. The intellectual diversity of these approaches reflects both the historical development of the discipline and the changing conditions of global governance. Taken together, they illuminate the multifaceted processes through which international rules are created, contested, internalized, and transformed. We begin with what might be considered the most enduring of the classical foundations, natural law theory. Its core idea is simple but powerful, that law is not created by humans, but derived from universal moral truths inherent in human nature. Some scholars trace this lineage back to theological and classical philosophical sources, demonstrating how natural law was historically invoked to limit the abuses of sovereign authority. In international law, this approach suggests that certain principles, like prohibitions against genocide, slavery, or torture, are binding irrespective of consent because they offend fundamental principles of justice. Even in the 21st century, echoes of natural law remain in doctrines like jus cogens, which operate as higher-order norms that no state may violate. Critics, of course, argue that natural law can be vague or culturally biased, but its influence is undeniable. Many of our most powerful legal prohibitions originate in the shared belief in intrinsic human dignity. By contrast, legal positivism grounds the authority of international law not in morality, but in state consent. Within this framework, law is valid when states intentionally create it through treaties, custom, or other recognized sources. International law derives authority from observable state behavior and agreements among states, not from abstract moral principles in this case. This approach is especially important in explaining why treaties must be explicit, why custom requires consistent state practice, and why sovereignty remains such a fiercely protected concept. Yet, positivism also reveals the limitations of the system. Because states must consent to be bound, powerful nations often avoid obligations they find inconvenient. Climate agreements, refugee protection frameworks, and even the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court all show the tension between collective need and sovereign insistence on autonomy. Recognizing these limitations, contemporary scholars have turned toward more sociological and constructivist approaches, which view international law as a dynamic, socially embedded practice rather than a fixed set of rules. International norms shift as global identities, politics, and moral expectations shift. Bottom-up change through non-governmental organizations, civil society, and advocacy networks often pushes states into new legal commitments, not the other way around. This is evident in the spread of human rights norms, environmental treaties, and anti-corruption mechanisms. The international legal system thus increasingly reflects not just state practice, but local movements, epistemic communities, and sustained pressure from transnational social actors. A related development is transnational legal process theory. It argues that international law is internalized, not through coercion, but through interaction, interpretation, and ultimately internal acceptance by domestic institutions. State compliance occurs because international norms become part of bureaucratic routines, professional expectations, judicial reasoning, and political culture. This helps explain why even states that resist certain international obligations often internalize related norms indirectly through professional networks, judicial engagement, or policy harmonization. Next, we turn to post-colonial and feminist perspectives, which challenge the notion that international law is neutral or universally representative. Scholars point out that modern international law emerged during periods of empire and carries traces of colonial power imbalances. Third world approaches to international law, in particular, highlights the colonial foundations of legal doctrines such as sovereignty, intervention, and development. Scholars argue that despite formal decolonization, global legal and economic structures often perpetuate hierarchical relationships that disadvantage the global South. They ask difficult but necessary questions such as who writes the rules, who benefits, who is marginalized. These perspectives offer crucial insights into structural bias and inequality embedded in global dominance frameworks. Feminist critiques similarly expose the ways in which international law has historically marginalized issues such as gender-based violence, economic inequality, and structural discrimination against women, urging the discipline to broaden its analytic and normative horizons. Another major development is international legal pluralism, which rejects the notion of international law as a singular hierarchical system. Instead, it proposes that global governance is woven through overlapping legal systems, such as domestic courts, trade bodies, regional agreements, and religious legal orders, all shaping international norms. This helps explain why international judgments sometimes clash with domestic rulings, why corporations increasingly participate in norm-making, and why global governance struggles to act consistently across issue areas. Rather than a unified orchestra, international law looks more like a crowded jazz improvisation, a condition that presents both challenges for coherence and opportunities for innovation. Policy-oriented and pragmatic schools of thought conceptualize international law not merely as a constraint on state behavior, but as a tool for facilitating cooperative problem-solving. Rooted in the New Haven School, these perspectives treat law as a process aimed at achieving shared human values, including security, welfare, environmental sustainability, and equitable development. In this view, legal norms must be evaluated in terms of their contribution to global public order. In a world of pandemics, cyber warfare, transnational crime, and ecological collapse, such policy-centered thinking has become increasingly indispensable. More recent scholarship reflects a discipline grappling with questions of legitimacy, authority, and equity in a rapidly changing world. It explores how international law confronts hegemonic power structures, how new actors assert influence, and how global legal norms adapt to shifting geopolitical conditions. All these approaches together show that international law is an evolving conversation shaped by moral ideals, state behavior, social movements, and power struggles. No single approach tells the whole story, but taken together, they reveal a richer, more nuanced understanding of how rules emerge, how states interact, and how global society tries, with varying degrees of success, to pursue order, justice, and human dignity. As new global challenges emerge, from artificial intelligence to mass displacement to planetary collapse, international law becomes an ever more essential framework for constructing a just and stable system of international governance. International law's future will likely be shaped by the interplays of these ideas: moral aspiration, pragmatic cooperation, resistance to domination, and an ever-expanding recognition of shared humanity. As it provides critical norms, institutions, and accountability mechanisms, it will continue to be indispensable for preventing conflict, enabling global cooperation, and promoting a more stable and peaceful world order.